It's Drybear. And I can't believe we're back here again. The Subnautica 2 drama situation just keeps evolving every single week with new discoveries, new problems, new lawsuits, and just more back and forth. And I know this is going to be a little bit exhausting for some people to keep up with. I'm kind of just doing highlights as we go along. So let's quickly do a very fast recap on where we're at, and then talk about the brand new lawsuit that was just filed in a way that you probably weren't expecting. So here's the skinny. Subnautica 2 was set to launch early 2024. It did not. Subnautica 2 was delayed to the end of 2024. It did not launch. It was delayed again to summer of this year, aiming around between maybe June, July, August, that sort of time frame. Since we're past that, it's very obvious Subnautica 2 did not launch. It was then delayed again to 2026. However, in a shocking turn of events, the founders and the C-suite leaders of the developer of Subnautica, Subnautica Below Zero, as well as Subnautica 2 and another game as well, were ejected. They were fired from their own company and removed, and everyone was freaking out and saying, what's going on? What is this? The story, after a while, progressed, and then we found out that Krafton, the publisher that had bought Subnautica Studio Unknown Worlds in 2021 for a sum of $500 million, ended up being a big part of firing the founders. And so the founders came back and said, we're not gonna stand for this. They had filed a lawsuit against Krafton claiming a breach of contract, saying that Krafton said they would stay out of the order of operations, like actually the day-to-day decision-making of Subnautica, and they claimed that Krafton did not. And so there's a lot of he said, she said. Were they doing it to try and make the money of a promised bonus? Krafton, in their purchase agreement, said that if, Unknown Worlds had hit a revenue target by the end of 2026, they would get a payout of $250 million to the founders and the studio. And Krafton was claiming that the only reason they wanted to kick Subnautica 2 out the door was because they just wanted to meet that target of hitting that revenue and getting that bonus. Krafton also said that the founders were going to take almost all of the $250 million for themselves, about $240 million or something like that, just for themselves. And so the community has been in a tizzy trying to figure out, is Krafton in the wrong? Are the founders in the wrong? Or I don't care, just give me the dang game so I can play it and enjoy it. And that's kind of where we were about a week ago. However, we just got a brand new lawsuit filed with the Court of Delaware in the United States that is pretty shocking. This time around, the development studio itself, Unknown Worlds, originally started by the three founders named in these two lawsuits, is suing the founders this time for stealing, confidential material as they were fired from the company. And what's interesting is in the last lawsuit we covered last week, Krafton alleged this exact thing, saying that the founders stole confidential material, stole proprietary assets, stole things from the company Unknown Worlds before they were fired and removed from the company. So this actually adds a little bit of credence to Krafton's claim that the founders were taking things, at least, regardless of what you believe on the situation itself. So let's look at the lawsuit in a little bit. It is quite long. I'm gonna try and summarize this, and we'll try to hit the high notes. Now, of course, it's a legal document, so there's gonna be a lot of context, a lot of very deliberate language to keep things clear, but they do mention, obviously, the three targets in this are Cleveland, McGuire, and Gill. Charlie, Max, and Ted are the names they go by in general. They talked about how, Ted was the business leader, Cleveland and McGuire were the creative stars, like technical and creative directors for the studio, and they're the ones that were kind of driving the force of Subnautica and Subnautica Below Zero, some of the most popular games in the industry in general. They summarized that in 2021, the Subnautica studio Unknown Worlds was purchased by Krafton for $500 million, so they got a nice hefty sum. There's also a reminder that the founders got a large portion of that as well as individuals, rather than going to the employees or the company specifically. But as we look through this, I'm gonna have the verbiage down below on screen. Try to pick through this. The more I read it, it does kind of seem like Krafton had someone at Unknown Worlds file this, because a lot of what we're seeing here is kind of lauding Krafton in a way. It doesn't necessarily mean that the context of the lawsuit itself is wrong. It's very possible that the founders did kind of run away with some confidential material from their exit in the studio. And also keep in mind that the lawsuit that the founders filed against Krafton does request that the courts reinstate the founders as leadership in Unknown Worlds, potentially even with back pay, and just put them back in their role because Krafton violated it. So there's definitely some language into here that favors Krafton in that light. Even text like this saying Krafton develops its own games, but has an even broader reach as one of the world's largest video game publishers. It enjoys access to markets around the world, including some such as Asia, where the Subnautica franchise still had considerable opportunity for growth. It's kind of corroborated by this as well. They kind of reinforce with this lawsuit coming from Unknown Worlds in this case, that the guaranteed $500 million to Unknown Worlds stockholders up front, a significant premium reflecting the business potential for the initial purchase. However, the lawsuit does state explicitly that Cleveland and McGuire pocketed almost blank apiece, while Gill received blank. So one of the parts of the Krafton filing is that the founders took most of the money for themselves, and they also alleged that the founders were trying to take most of the $250 million payout for themselves again as well. And that same language is repeated here in this lawsuit from Unknown Worlds. It also reaffirms that there was a anticipation of a bright future with the ongoing team, and so the purchase agreement provided for an additional revenue-based earnout of up to $250 million if they hit sales targets by the end of 2026, which is what they're, by the end of 2025, I guess. So they're trying to get that done. And then Krafton is saying that the reason that the founders were trying to rush out early access for Subnautica 2, whether you believe it's rushed or not, was to try and get that payout rather than trying to make the best game that they could. But further down into the lawsuit, they mentioned that in connection with the purchase agreement, the original purchase agreement in 2021, the founders also executed employment agreements in which they committed to specific roles and duties within the company, which also extended to a promise not to use or disclose Unknown Worlds' confidential information, agreed to promptly return any confidential information and company property upon their termination or Unknown Worlds request. So this is where the lawsuit kind of gets into its details here, where Unknown Worlds as a as a company is saying that they did not they didn't promptly return the confidential information. They didn't make good on their promise not to use it, and they walked away with a bunch of it, which was against their their agreements as part of that acquisition. Further down in the lawsuit, this is where Unknown Worlds' lawsuit gets very pointed. They say the bright future from the parties, including the founders, the creators of the company, the Unknown Worlds, the developer of Subnautica 2, and the publisher Krafton, they're saying the bright future between the three of them anticipated in 2021 was not to be. Written in plain text in this lawsuit. This lawsuit arises because the key employees, the three founders, despite their roles as officers and directors, largely abandoned the company, the Subnautica game, and the gaming community that has been anticipating new adventures in the sequel in Subnautica 2. So this is a heavy, very, gravitas argument being thrown here, saying that the founders abandoned all of their roles, they abandoned their fellow employees, they abandoned their, obligations to the purchase agreement, and they even abandoned the community as well. It goes on to state that compounding the abandonment that they're alleging here, each of the three founders downloaded substantial volumes of company confidential information on their way out the door. Unknown Worlds brings this lawsuit to recover damages for the injuries caused by the abandonment and breach of their fiduciary duties to the company, and to put Krafton and Unknown Worlds in the position they would be in if it didn't happen. Further down, it even says that the Unknown Worlds leadership was central to it, but rather than devote their time and efforts to Subnautica 2's release, at least two of the key employees checked out in all but name. So you have to kind of, let me know what you think. I mean, from the outside, it's hard for us to know with certainty, but at least from this, Krafton is alleging that the founders let everyone down. Now this lawsuit that is stated to come from Unknown Worlds, is filed in the name of Unknown Worlds, is agreeing with Krafton and kind of putting the founders in the hot spot here. So let me know what you think about this. Do you actually think that there is an internal perspective in Unknown Worlds right now that the founders let them down and that they were screwing everything over and making Subnautica 2 not a reality, and that Krafton's in the right and the founders are in the wrong? Do you think that potentially Krafton is trying to pull the strings to involve, Unknown Worlds as a secondary line of offense for their war against the founders, and then the founders going at war with Krafton? Or what are your thoughts on this, and how do you read this kind of language? Then they go on to kind of like name them one by one and actually look at the founders here. So Cleveland, Charlie, he was kind of like the creative lead for most of the Subnauticas. He also worked on Natural Selection, an awesome mod, and Natural Selection 2, if you've never played them, an asymmetrical game, very, very fun. So they're kind of targeting Charlie right now. So Charlie was the first to stray. Despite publicly holding himself out as the CEO and game director of Unknown Worlds, he was gradually becoming disengaged. In 2022, just a year after their purchase, the lead developer in Subnautica 2, a franchise and project supposedly led by Cleveland, openly complained that the project had no creative leadership, and I haven't been able to get much of Charlie's time lately and sort of don't know what he really thinks or wants to hear. By 2023, Cleveland announced to his friends and some colleagues that he was leaving video game development to learn how to produce movies and explore other interests. So what's interesting about this perspective too is this certainly could be true. I think there was definitely, it seems like from all the legal documents we've read that Krafton was purchasing Unknown Worlds in 2021 with the idea that they would want to expand the Subnautica IP into every medium possible. Mobile games, movies, TV shows. We've seen the success of Last of Us on TV, Fallout on TV, movies coming to, the big screen, all of that, merchandise, trying to get more monetization out of that IP and make it grow. So some people believe that Krafton wanted the founders to actually expand out into movie making, TV making, all of that. And some people believe that Charlie was going, he had moved away from, the Northern California studio location that they had and moved closer to Los Angeles so that he could get in with Hollywood and meet with people, rub hands and share drinks and try to get Subnautica, commissioned as a movie or a series or something like that, that it was all part of that agreement. And some people believe that no, he was just kind of dipping and didn't want to make games anymore. So let me know what your perspective is on that down below. They even allege that he later changed his LinkedIn profile to part-time developer, and by 2024 he abandoned all creative or other leadership roles with the company. The technical lead, McGuire, spent 2022 and 2023 buried in passion project of a new game, Moonbreaker, even well past the time it became clear that Moonbreaker was a commercial failure. I think it's pretty objective to say that Moonbreaker was a commercial failure. Most people don't even know what that game actually was, because when it came out, it pretty much flopped by almost every major metric. It doesn't mean that he wasn't also able to contribute meaningfully to Subnautica, but I think it is fair and factual to say that Moonbreaker was a bit of a distraction and also not a very good success for Unknown Worlds in general. They then say that, later on, eventually, McGuire too abandoned any pretense of technical involvement in Subnautica 2, and Gil, who was doing the business management, who assumed the role of CEO, was fully aware of the situation and did nothing about it. Cleveland, McGuire remained officers and directors of the company, and as this lawsuit alleges, did nothing for Subnautica, despite their functional departures from game development or leadership. They even allege that between 2023 and 2025, development of Subnautica 2 stalled. And this lawsuit is alleging that the reason that Subnautica 2 was delayed from Q1 of 2024 to Q4 of 2024 to later summer of 2025 and now to 2026, almost 2 years after the original intended launch window for the game. This lawsuit is alleging that the reason that it was delayed is solely placed on the founders themselves, which I think is kind of a hard pill to swallow. It's really hard for me to say that the leadership are the sole reason why a game gets delayed. There could be a lot of reasons, and without knowing what the internal structure was like and what they were working on internally, it's really hard to know whether this is actually true or not, but it could at least be in part true. Like, obviously they can, make the development team rework on assets, change direction, saying, hey, we don't want this biome anymore, make a new one, throw everything out and start over. Like, they can cause a lot of issues, and there's plenty of examples of, you know, leadership, either leads, management, or C-suite, or even like GM, EP level employees causing lots of disruption and setting timelines back by their own actions individually, which could be true, but you know, it's hard to know from the outside. And this is where things kind of get very Krafton-y, because this lawsuit alleges that worse, the scope of the projected release was degraded time and time again. What was originally projected to be a limited scope early access release was limited to little more than a sandbox. And this is what the Krafton lawsuit, or the Krafton post, was alleging, is that the game was not ready. They estimated that the game was about 12% complete when the founders and Unknown Worlds wanted to put it out to early access. Krafton went on record officially and with the courts saying that 12% is not enough for an early access version of the game. However, you know, anyone that played the game was under a non-disclosure agreement, so they can't really talk about it, and we never got to play that version of the game either, since it never shipped and went live. So only people under employment agreements and NDAs played it, so it's hard for us to actually believe them or understand where they're coming from. It's very possible that the version that they wanted to kick out to early access for Subnautica 2 was in fact undercooked and unprepared, and so, you know, everyone would have hated it. I think that enough people like Subnautica that even if it was only a single biome with a single page of things to craft, and we could just jump in, try the building, gather some stuff, and most importantly, try out the multiplayer, because Subnautica has historically been a single player game. Subnautica 2 has multiplayer functionality. I think that a portion of the audience in Subnautica would have been perfectly fine playing a 12% complete early access game. I mean, if you look at, you know, early access like Grounded 2 that just launched, the size of the map, it's like 22% of the overall map with a very limited scope, but people still love it. I played Grounded 2, it's great. I'm looking forward to their roadmap as they add more content in general, but let me know where your head is at on early access. Is Krafton right in saying that the game was undercooked for early access? Is that a thing? Can it be truly undercooked? And Krafton also believes that, you know, if you kick something out that's too underdeveloped, it can end up hurting the brand, and that was their major argument, is that because the founders wanted to go into early access in the state the game was in, Krafton believes that that would have harmed the Subnautica brand because the game was just not good enough even to an early access standard. Now, they also say that they were pointing at potentially, I mean, a lot of people have speculated that the release window was going to be about August, or maybe like, you know, July, August timeframe. So, you know, it would have been in our hands by now, and we've been playing it for the last month or so. And Krafton says, and even this Unknown Worlds lawsuit seems to agree with Krafton, that there simply would not be enough to be saleable, compelling content to warrant an early access release until then. Krafton, the sole stockholder, intended publisher of Subnautica 2, expressed its concerns with the founders across several meetings. So again, this lawsuit is agreeing with Krafton in almost every major way, that the founders didn't put enough effort into the game, that the game was not ready, it shouldn't have been kicked out to early access, and it sounds like, at least from this verbiage, that Unknown Worlds was in alignment with that idea. This lawsuit, from Unknown Worlds' perspective, also alleges that every delay from the contemplated release window around summertime this year hurt the company's revenue and reputation. Worse still, however, would be a release that the substantial Subnautica community would have rejected. I think that if they wanted to make this process sit well with the community, I think they should have probably just launched a beta weekend or something, right? Like, actually make it so the general community can get hands on the game. You can make it so it's like you get access for a weekend, it's a demo, right? Like, it's a limited access demo. For 2 or 3 days, you can play it and try it. And then I think if that was actually trash gaming that would have aligned with their accusations here, I think it would have been a lot easier for them to get the gaming community on board. However, since they never actually shipped it, and, you know, people that weren't under NDA never got to play it, it's really hard, I think, for the community at large to accept and stomach the idea that the early access version of the game would be a release that the substantial Subnautica gaming community would have rejected. And this language here, again, agrees with Krafton, saying that Subnautica 2 should be a series that's built to expand, buying new releases and new versions over time, and with the second game would offer novel gameplay along with new and compelling narratives and new features such as vehicles or creatures that had not been previously offered. Krafton's big argument that we looked at last week was really just around the idea that in general, the sequel should be much better than the first game, much better than Below Zero, and make a big splash, pun intended, on the gaming community in Subnautica as a whole, and that the second game that they wanted to push out into early access did not meet those standards and was not good enough relative to that. This lawsuit, from the perspective of Unknown Worlds, also says that gamers disinterested with the pared down introductory storyline put off by uninteresting gameplay or otherwise simply bored by the insufficiently developed release could abandon the entire sequel, or worse, the entire franchise. For the company, the goal was always to produce a game that the gaming community wanted and would continue to want. So now, Krafton and now Unknown Worlds are on record saying that the Subnautica 2 early access would have been so horrendous, so awful, so garbage that it would be uninteresting, introductory, pared down, insufficiently developed, and would cause the entire community of Subnautica to abandon the sequel, never buy it, and not, lose interest in the IP in general. Interestingly enough as well, another thing, these are some pretty bold stinger statements. They allege that the founders never once since 2022, they never once had on calendar or managed to convene a single board meeting on record after 2022, failed to present or adopt a single board resolution regarding material business matters, and failed to pursue even fundamental industry standard steps to protect the company's intellectual property. The founders, for example, allowed blank issue to fester, and they oversaw a slipshod approach to blank, saying that basically not only were they abandoning their duties, they weren't involved in the development, they weren't looking out for Unknown Worlds at all. They basically checked out and weren't even in the office or in their chair, or could be found in their office desk. They also never called a board meeting. They never managed to rule on any official directorial level details or company level details as a C-suite employee. They never managed to do anything. They actually just weren't doing anything since 2022 at all. They were simply a figurehead. They were getting paid outrageous amounts of money for doing nothing for the game, which is what they're alleging here. Even going on to saying that while ignoring their duties at the company and their fans, the founders nonetheless found time to focus on their own self-interest, namely to strategize over their potential earnout payment under the purchase agreement. So this is kind of crazy coming from, this is filed under the name of Unknown Worlds. They're saying that the founders did nothing for the company and focused entirely on their own personal pet projects and trying to maximize their payouts and their earnings from the purchase agreement, and no other goal in general. Even stating that one of the developers internally to Unknown Worlds, not named in this lawsuit, wrote to Ted or to McGuire, "I do think Ted will concoct a scheme to get us that earnout." Again, saying that their only goal was to take the $500 million from the purchase and then get the $250 million earnout and then run and then store it up and go spend it on cocaine and hookers or something. And this kind of mirrors Krafton's idea as well, saying that the founders realized that the pre-order demand and franchise value of Subnautica 2 presented their best opportunity to spike short-term sales, even if it meant harming the franchise. So not only are they saying that the founders tried to rush the game out so they could hit the sales targets and get their payout, but they also intended to harm the franchise long term, saying that it was driven by self-interest and contrary to the best interests of Unknown Worlds. The founders resolved to publish whatever they could, shrug, under the Subnautica 2 name on a timeline that didn't tank the earnout opportunity. And even crazier, when Krafton refused to publish the game before it was ready, the founders openly threatened Krafton with litigation, expressly demanding and prioritizing a release date for Subnautica 2 that would allow them to capture blank of Subnautica 2 revenue toward the earnout targets. Put simply, in no uncertain terms, in the Unknown Worlds lawsuit, the key employees announced their priorities clearly. They demanded the earnout, not the early access release that would best entice the gaming community into the Subnautica 2 world. Personal, not company goals were the priority for the founders. Even stating, no joke, that Krafton was trying to hold firm and standing strong for the community of Subnautica, championing your interests as a gamer. They tried to stop the evil founders from kicking out a game that wasn't ready to be released, and then, the founders founders threatened to self-publish without Krafton's involvement, and Krafton said that self-publication would generate some revenue, serving the founders' personal goals, but it risked failing to deliver the success necessary to sustain and build the franchise. So too, self-publication would send mixed and concerning signals to the active Subnautica community, concerns that would be reinforced by a subpar release. So they're actually saying that the founders were trying to ship the game without Krafton's involvement, and without Krafton being involved in the shipment, that the community wouldn't have liked the game, they wouldn't have enjoyed it, and they would have been mad about it because it wasn't, it wasn't being aided by Krafton's wonderful hand. Now, again, I'm being a little facetious with this, but it does, this sounds like it's coming directly from Krafton, not Unknown Worlds. Now, it could be that Unknown Worlds was on the side with Krafton all along, so you can read it into this however you want and let me know what your perspective is. It just feels like this is like, like they're using Unknown Worlds as a mouthpiece. Like, this is the same language, the same accusations, the same verbiage that Krafton was using in their own accusations against the founders, just now being filed under Unknown Worlds in general. And it goes even further to say that even though the founders' scheme of prioritizing the earnout over game development and goodwill materialized, Unknown Worlds, not Krafton, Unknown Worlds was left with no choice but to terminate the employment. And this was kind of a big shocker that we got last week from Krafton. Krafton was alleging that Krafton never fired the founders. They had no involvement in that. Like, it was Unknown Worlds that fired them, not Krafton. And then with this Unknown Worlds filing with the Court of Delaware, they're trying to reinforce that by saying Unknown Worlds, not Krafton, not the publisher, the development studio, was left with no choice but to terminate the founders and get them out of the company. They were informed that if they continued to insist on premature release of Subnautica 2, the studio, Unknown Worlds, would take all actions necessary to prevent inevitable and irreversible harm to the Subnautica brand. Now, back to the main argument of this lawsuit, which is stealing confidential information. They say that after all this had happened, the founders were told they have to just actually do real work and not run away and hide. They actually have to get involved and work on the game. And after, all of this, they were threatening to self-publish without Krafton, and Krafton was trying to champion the game community and make sure the game was good, just like they stand for all gamers in the world. They allege that the founders, after being threatened with litigation and doing all of this, the founders began to remove company confidential information to their personal devices. Gil exported his entire Unknown Worlds email account on June 2nd, 2025, and again on June 30th, and McGuire and Cleveland grew more active in the week. Now, there's definitely going to be some of this of them taking their personal files. It could also be that they wanted to have, a history of communication so that if this ended up going to court, which it has gone to court, many different lawsuits are now filing and kind of active for the trifecta of Unknown Worlds, the founders, and Krafton, which are in this schoolyard brawl with each other. It could be, if they didn't get copies of the communications and all of the interactions between each other, that it would have been nearly impossible for them to defend themselves in court because Krafton would control all of the details of their work emails, meaning that they couldn't refute any claims, right? If they didn't have access to the communications and Krafton says, hey, you guys said this, they don't have the way to refute that because they don't have access to those emails, that would be very awkward. I could definitely see the intention of hey, let's keep track of communications so that we can actually, file these lawsuits and defend ourselves in the way we think possible. But there also is going to be some proprietary information, confidential information, and with the employment agreements that they signed, and potentially even with the details of that purchase agreement from the M&A, the acquisition that happened when the change of control went over to Krafton, that it says that you can't, right? And you really have to understand that if you're a public company and you're owned by someone else, there are rules and restrictions around what you can keep, what you can't, and all of that. So it both can be true. It could be that they wanted to have access to records so that they can, let this thing run its course and actually be part of the battle, or they were trying to steal something. Both of those could be true. They even say that McGuire downloaded 99,902 company files in the days leading up to his termination, and Cleveland downloaded 72,140 company files. This is a little misleading, I think, just because when they say that they were downloading their emails, when they download 100,000 files, does that mean they're downloading correspondence, like actual like text files? Are they downloading game files and game packages? Are they downloading assets? Are they downloading images, concept art? Like, what is 100,000 file? Like, if I say 100,000 files, what does that mean? Like, that could mean a lot of different things. That could be they downloaded, 10 game packages and 95,000 emails, right, as text files. That could mean that they downloaded the entire, version control branch of the entire Subnautica 2, keeping hold of the game code, the game files, and the engine and all of that. Like, that's pretty serious. And we've seen some of those play out with, games like Dark and Darker, where they were, kicked from the company, they left the company, but they did download some game files and actual assets, which got them in legal trouble in general. But when you say generic files, I think that begs a little bit more description on what you mean by files. However, they say that Cleveland was stopped in the middle of his activity. Like, his mom walked in while he was watching, was looking at a nudie mag, and he looked up all shaken. Cleveland was stopped in the middle of the activity. His last download from the company system occurred just 8 minutes before the company terminated his system access. These downloads were, by far, the largest downloads for each of the 3 key employees at any time since at least 2022, which honestly is, you're talking about like trying to save or hold on to things. If you know you're being terminated and you know there's going to be a legal battle, I think it's understandable that would be the most download, but it doesn't mean that they're innocent, right? If they had employment agreements that say you can't keep anything, and in general, especially in the United States, if you work for a company, you don't own anything that you do or anything that you create on company time. This is something that a lot of individual employees in the United States specifically struggle with, in that they think, well, I made a personal call on work hours. If you do anything in the main office of that company, if you do anything on work hours or on work property or with work email or with work company, even if it's not something that the company owns, that makes the waters very murky. And there have been many cases in dozens of industries where employees did something on work time that had nothing to do with the company, but they end up losing rights over it because they were doing it on company time. So you have to be careful with this, especially in the United States, when you mess with this kind of stuff, because this law is very clear. Like, the law around this is very clear. Now, here they kind of further on and say that downloads included company confidential information of every type: business records, game intellectual property, redacted, and communications from within the company. So they do say that there were communications, there were business records, but also they downloaded game intellectual property, and the rest of that line is redacted. Now, does that mean actual game packages? Does that mean they pulled from version control and started pulling from the branch of the game and started taking game code or backend or like anything proprietary to the company or the game as well? It sounds like they are kind of suggesting that, but with the rest of this line redacted, it's hard to say for sure, but it does sound like it was a mixture of things: correspondence, records, documents, contracts, as well as game files. And I guess the drama continues here, because it says that Krafton and, it says Unknown Worlds. It says Unknown Worlds requested, as is standard, access to the 3 founders' personal devices: phones, laptops, tablets, home computers, all of their personal devices. Unknown Worlds said, hey, give us access to these so we can see if you have anything about the company. Now that you no longer work here, you've been fired, you've been terminated, give us access to all your personal devices so we can inspect them and make sure that you don't have anything on there that you're not supposed to have. And they say that the founders said, no, we're not going to do that. You can't have my phone. You can't have my laptop. I'm not going to show it to you. And instead, upon information and belief, they retained those files. When pushed, the founders threatened to delete the files and again refused to provide access to their devices containing confidential information for inspection. So a doozy, man. Like, I feel like now that we've had the founders sue Krafton, we now have the Unknown Worlds developer suing the founders. Now we just need Krafton to sue Unknown Worlds, and the triangle is complete and the drama cycle continues, because this whole storyline is just getting wild. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are just exhausted and ready to just play the damn game once it's done, and they're tired of all this. But this is like one of the most bizarre, like drama-filled actions in gaming that we've seen in a very long time. Just like super out there, and there's just a whole bunch of he said, she said, whatever. I'm sure that there's wrongdoing on all sides. Usually with cases like this, when they're this complicated and kind of murky, it ends up being that everyone has done wrong in some form or fashion, but let me know where your head is at. Are you on the side of the founders saying that they've been wronged and they shouldn't have been terminated? Are you on the side of Krafton saying that Krafton did everything by the book and the founders were failing? Are you on the side of the developers making the game? They just want to get the game out and they're tired of all the leadership and C-suite and, you know, multi-billion-dollar companies getting involved in their business and trying to muck things up? Or are you on the side of just, I don't care what these human beings are doing, stop involving me in drama and just give me a good game that I can play and enjoy? Let me know your perspective down below. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.